The young soldier is sitting on a cot in a field hospital in Sicily. He is not bleeding. There are no visible wounds. Around him, men are missing limbs. Men are dying. And this private, 21 years old, 4 years in the regular army, a combat veteran of Tunisia and North Africa, is simply sitting there, trembling, unable to stop crying. The doctor's chart says, battle fatigue. George Patton reads that chart. And something inside the most aggressive American general of the Second World War breaks completely. What he does next will make front pages across the United States. It will nearly end his career. It will humiliate him before the men he commands, and it will help win the war. If you're new here, welcome. This channel tells the real stories, the ones that don't fit cleanly into hero or villain. Subscribe, ring the bell. This is one of those stories. August of 1943. Sicily. The heat is savage, over 100 degrees on the bleached stone roads climbing toward Messina. Patton's 7th Army has been grinding forward for weeks, and the commanding general does what he always does. He goes to the hospitals. He visits the wounded. He pins medals. He looks his men in the eye. By every account, this is the duty that cost him the most. This man who could order thousands into fire without flinching would reportedly weep at the sight of the most grievously injured. The armor was real. So was what lived underneath it. He enters the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia. He moves cot to cot. He is in full uniform, polished helmet, ivory-handled pistols, riding boots. He stops. He pins a medal on a soldier whose leg is gone. He moves to the next man, and the next. Then he reaches Private Charles H. Cool, 18 years old. Indiana, no visible wounds, just sitting there. "What's the matter with you?" Patton asks. The private looks up at the 3-star general and says, "I guess I can't take it." Patton slaps him across the face with his gloves, grabs him by the collar, drags him to the entrance of the tent, and kicks him out. "Don't admit this son of a bitch," he shouts at the medical staff. "I don't want yellow-bellied bastards like him hiding their lousy cowardice around here, stinking up this place of honor." The entire ward, men missing hands, men with their faces wrapped in gauze, men who will never walk again, watches in silence. What Patton does not know, Cool has a fever of 102 degrees. He has malaria. He was correctly admitted by the doctors responsible for his care. He is not a coward. He is sick. That night, Patton writes in his diary that men like Cool should be tried for cowardice and shot. 7 days pass. Patton visits the 93rd Evacuation Hospital near San Stefano. He moves through the ward again. He stops at another cot. Private Paul G. Bennett, 21 years old, 4 years in the regular army, gunner in the 17th Field Artillery Regiment. Tunisia, Sicily, not a single mark on his record. Then, 6 days ago, his closest friend was torn apart by shellfire in front of him. Since then, Bennett cannot sleep, cannot stop shaking. The medical officers who see him recognize what they are looking at and refuse to send him back to the line. He is sitting up on his cot, shivering, when Patton reaches him. "What's your problem?" Patton asks. Paul Bennett begins to cry. He says, "It's my nerves. I can't stand the shelling anymore." Patton's voice drops to something dangerous. He calls Bennett a coward. He pulls out his pistol. He waves it in the young soldier's face and tells him he ought to be lined up against a wall and shot. He strikes him across the face. Bennett collapses in tears. Patton hits him a second time. The doctors and nurses standing in that tent do not move. Later, Patton will write in his diary that he may have saved Bennett's soul. He adds, if he had one. The ranking surgeon at the 93rd files a formal report that same day. It travels up the chain of command. Within 48 hours, it reaches General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Mediterranean. 4 American journalists covering Sicily learn of both incidents. Demery Bess of the Saturday Evening Post, Merrill Mueller of NBC, Al Newman of Newsweek, John Charles Daly of CBS. They have enough to break one of the largest stories of the war. They interview witnesses. They have the facts. They make a decision that 60 years later is almost impossible to imagine. They fly to Algiers and bring the story directly to Eisenhower. They tell him they are Americans first. They agree to kill the story. Eisenhower was now sitting with a crisis that had no clean answer. Patton had just delivered him Sicily, the 7th Army's race across the island, Palermo in 10 days, now closing on Messina. was the fastest American ground campaign of the war to that point. When Eisenhower looked ahead to the liberation of Europe, he saw one general on the Allied side whose instinct for relentless pursuit, whose willingness to outrun his supply lines and push through exhaustion and darkness and confusion was in a class by itself. He also saw a general who had walked into a field hospital and pistol-whipped a feverish soldier in front of his medical staff. On August 17th, the day Patton's forces enter Messina and Sicily falls, Eisenhower delivers his private rebuke in writing. "I clearly understand," he writes, "that firm and drastic measures are at times necessary, but this does not excuse brutality, abuse of the sick, nor exhibition of uncontrollable temper in front of subordinates." Patton must apologize, to both soldiers personally, to the medical personnel, to every division of the 7th Army, out loud, face to face. He does not relieve him of command. Not yet. What happens next is one of the most remarkable moments in the history of American military command. Patton obeys. He meets with Private Bennett on August 21st, Private Cool on August 22nd. He shakes their hands. He says he was wrong. He says he did not understand the severity of their conditions. Then he faces his army. He stands before the 3rd Infantry Division, the men who have been following him into fire for months. He begins to apologize. They will not let him. Before he can finish, the soldiers begin to shout, "No, General, no, no." They chant until, according to witnesses, Patton is visibly overwhelmed and leaves the stage. There is something in that moment that history has never quite resolved. It was not approval. It was not absolution. It was something rawer and more complicated. Men who had been pushed past the edge of what they thought they could endure by this man, refusing to let him diminish himself in front of them, because they needed him, not the apology, him. 2 weeks later, the story breaks anyway. November 21st, 1943, 7 in the evening. The journalist Drew Pearson goes on the Blue Network radio and tells America that General George S. Patton struck a hospitalized soldier in Sicily and was reprimanded by Eisenhower. The response is immediate and furious. Congressional demands for Patton's dismissal come from both parties. Representative Jed Johnson of Oklahoma calls his conduct despicable. Pershing, the commander of the AEF in the First World War, Patton's own mentor, condemns him publicly. One of Patton's most prominent defenders turns out to be Herman Kool, the father of the first soldier who was struck. He writes to Washington and asks the government to accept Patton's apology and let him get back to fighting. His son Charles, who never fully forgave the slap and who would later say that Patton was suffering a little battle fatigue himself, would land at Normandy on D-Day, 1944. He survived the war. Private Paul Bennett never returned to frontline duty. He was transferred to rear area assignments. The first words he spoke after the incident, reported by those who were there, were not about Patton, not about the hospital, not about the shelling. He said, "Don't tell my wife. Don't tell my wife." Eisenhower pulled Patton from combat command. For nearly a year, George Patton had no army. And then the Allied planners building toward D-Day made a decision that turned his disgrace into a weapon. The German High Command had one certainty about the coming Allied invasion of Europe. Wherever it landed, the decisive thrust would be led by Patton. He was, in their assessment, the finest American battlefield commander. To their doctrine, it was simply not credible that the Allies would deploy their best general on a secondary operation. So the planners built a ghost army around him. Operation Fortitude, a fictional force called the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, inflatable rubber tanks in the fields of southeast England, dummy landing craft in harbor mouths visible to Luftwaffe reconnaissance, fake radio traffic running 24 hours a day from the tunnels beneath Dover Castle. And at the center of all of it, General George S. Patton, photographed touring these phantom encampments, making public appearances, loudly referencing the Pas de Calais in hotel lobbies where German agents were known to be listening. In May 1944, the Allies arranged for a captured German general, Hans Kramer of the Afrika Korps, being repatriated due to serious illness, to have dinner with Patton himself. The general played his role with surgical precision. He was driven through what he believed was southeast England. In reality, he was driven through the southwest, past the actual invasion preparations for Normandy, while fake road signs pointed him toward the wrong coast. Kramer was exhaustively debriefed upon returning to Germany. He told them Patton was coming for the Pas-de-Calais. He believed it completely, because Patton had made him believe it. When Allied forces hit the beaches at Normandy on June 6, 1944, Hitler held his armored reserves in place for 7 weeks. He was waiting for the real attack. He was waiting for Patton. The general whose career had nearly ended in a field hospital in Sicily had become so radioactive, so famous, so necessary in the enemy's imagination, that his very disgrace had made him the most valuable deception asset in the war. On August 1, 1944, 1 year and 2 days after the first slap, 3rd U.S. Army was activated in France under Patton's command. Omar Bradley, who had served under Patton in Sicily and who had never liked him, now commanded above him. The men had traded positions. Patton received his orders from the man who had once received his. He didn't waste a day. The Third Army drove across France at a pace that stunned Allied commanders watching from above. Then, in December of 1944, when the German offensive in the Ardennes threatened to split the Allied line and the 101st Airborne was surrounded and dying at Bastogne, Patton pivoted his entire army, more than 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, 90 degrees in 3 days. In winter, through fog and frozen roads, he relieved Bastogne on December 26th. Many military historians consider it the most extraordinary feat of operational command in the European theater. What do we do with George Patton? He was wrong in those hospitals. Completely, inexcusably wrong. The condition now called combat stress reaction, which the Army labeled battle fatigue in 1943, and which we now recognize as a physiological response to sustained trauma related to what we call PTSD, was real, it was documented, and it was not something a soldier could overcome by being slapped by a general. Charles Kuhl never fully recovered from his wartime experience. He died young, of a heart attack he attributed in part to the war. Paul Bennett never went back to the front. He just wanted his wife not to know. These men were failed by the man who commanded them. That is part of the record, and it does not go away. But the men of the 3rd Division would not let Patton apologize. The father of the first soldier he struck defended him in Congress, and when Patton finally got his army back and turned it loose across France, the men under his command fought with a speed and ferocity that no other formation in the war could match. Omar Bradley, the most careful, the most measured, the least sentimental general in the American Army, said something about Patton that may be the only honest summary on record. He said, "I do this job because I've been trained to do it. You do it because you love it." What that love cost. What it made possible. The lines are not cleanly separable. The war is the context. And in that context, this story refuses a simple verdict, which is perhaps why it still demands to be told. Leave a comment. Do you think Eisenhower made the right call in keeping Patton? And do you think history has been fair to the men he struck? Subscribe. Ring the bell. Every week, a real story. Complicated,